Halt, who goes there? It's just me. Sir talks a lot. Hope you folks are doing okay. Am I the most embarrassing dad ever? I am. I'm probably more embarrassing than most of your dads. That's okay. I hope you folks are doing well, hanging in there. It still continues to be a tough time, and the faculty are very aware of what everyone's going through. I was thinking today, despite what you might be seeing on TV, there are a lot of smart people that are in charge ultimately. So despite what you might see being reported by politicians and that sort of thing, there are a lot of scientists that are advising, and they're going to help out. And so I think ultimately we are going to be in good hands, and we should kind of trust the science as it goes along. It's a weird time to be a scientist when there's so many conspiracy theories and doubts going on about science, but I am absolutely confident that science has the best answers to these sorts of questions that we're all dealing with right now. And ultimately, it will be what guides us through all this. So again, there's smart people in charge. You found that out with your chancellor, who's, I think, was very helpful last class, and it gave us a lot of good ideas. And even if no decisions have been made yet about opening up in the fall, they are thinking about every possible contingency and should really be waiting till the very last minute that they can to make a decision, because they need all this data coming in from all these places. So hang on, the best decisions will be made, and it will be made for your safety and health and that of your families. So, okay, before we got started today, I thought maybe I would take some time and answer any questions you have on the exam. So you saw that we posted the exam outcome on Thursday night, so it was available to you as early as Friday morning for some of you. But I wanted to see if you had any questions. Just let me give you the basic information. So my visor keeps closing. That's cool. So it can help you before you ask the questions. First of all, we don't assign letter grades now. What we're doing is just giving you a rough idea of what the grade range is going to be. We do assign pluses and minuses and all that stuff ultimately, so that will be part of your grade. We just want to right now give you an idea of whether your score ended up in the A range, B range, C range, etc. What we do is we just add up all your points at the end between the midterm and the final, see how everyone did in the class, and then assign a letter grade at that point based on your total. We're being very generous this quarter, just if you haven't gotten that sense. Certainly, if you calculate the percentages and all that sort of stuff, you'll be able to see that we've been very, very, lenient in terms of the grade ranges. So let me take a second to see if there's any questions about the grading in the exam right now, and then we'll start talking about our new material. Okay, so let's do a little chat. Oh, what place is that in the background? Oh, that's a lovely question, Aida. I believe it's someplace in Scotland. I don't know the details though, but if you ever have a chance to go to Scotland or Ireland, I heartily recommend it. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen in the world. It's just wonderful. Questions about the exam? Anything about the gradings or the exam format or anything like that? Nothing? You guys are all hearing me okay, right? I just want to make sure. I always like to make sure of that. Everybody can hear me? Give me a yes if you can hear. Good, good, good. Okay. Okay, I guess you're happy with the exam. Oh, I didn't post the average? Oh, sorry about that. The average was, I believe, a 46 out of the 60. So that gives you some sense of how generous we were with the grade range. Listen, let me tell you what my philosophy is, and I've gone back and forth in this, and not everybody in the department has the same philosophy. But for a course like this, the way I feel about it is that the purpose, it's not a course for your major, it's an elective. The purpose I see for a course like this is just to be a very healthy distraction. This visor keeps on going down. Oh, I know what it is. Whenever I raise my eyebrows, yeah, it goes up and down. Yeah, there it is. Good. Okay. So I'll try not to in the next few seconds. Um, I'm seeing this course as a healthy distraction for you, given what you guys are going through, what we're all going through. And, you know, I don't really worry too much if you're getting all the technical details. What I don't want this course to do is add to your stress level. That being said, I believe that if we continue to engage in the material, we can see that our intellectual endeavors, as I said this before, our intellectual endeavors allow us to kind of distract ourselves from our worries in a healthy way. So I would like you to study. I would like you to, you know, read the book. I'd like you to you know, watch the videos. And I know I'm kind of talking to the folks that are here during the synchronous lectures, and I actually worry about you folks less. I worry about the students that aren't coming to the live lectures and then are supposedly watching the videos. To be honest, we have records of the video views, and there's, you know, not as many as I had hoped, and they're not as for the full duration, so people are skimming through them. You folks that are here live are doing great, but I would love everybody to find this course as a healthy distraction, a way of getting interested in something that takes your mind off of everything we're worrying about. So at least for this quarter, hopefully that's what we're achieving. Other questions? What was the average? Okay, how does the letter grading work? As I just said, Woo, that we're not going to assign the letter grades until both grades are in, both the scores are in from the midterm and final. Then we assign letter grades, and there will be pluses and minuses. Is there a pattern in what we got wrong that we could focus on and fixing in the final? Chelsea asked this one. It's a great question. And no, there's no general pattern overall in the class. But what I recommend you do, if you're concerned about your grade, is absolutely talk to your TA who will go through your particular test with you. And that will help you determine what you got wrong on the test and if there is, in fact, a pattern. Okay, other questions about the exam before we start getting to the new material? Okay, great. Let's continue then. And let me get rid of this silly visor. It was cute for a little while. Okay. So what we're going to do is continuing talking today about touch, and what we're using touch for more than anything else is a way to, there we go, okay, hold on a second, a way to understand something more general about the brain. So yes, we will be talking about things that have to do with our sensitivity to touch and what we can do with touch, but that's going to come more in the second lecture I have on touch. The first lecture, the first lecture that I'm going through right now really has to do with something more general, and that is, sorry about this, what is going on? That has to do with, this is a slide you saw already. This has to do with what we call cross-modal plasticity. So there's the term right there that I want to concentrate on. And the idea is that if we lose a sense or even have a sense that's degraded, that what you see is that the rest of the brain kind of adjusts and compensate for that lost sense, and then even makes use of the part of the brain that would be dealing with the sense that has been lost. So we've talked about this already. We talked about the fact that for people that are blind at an early age, their visual cortex, the visual parts of their brain, start helping out with other senses. They start helping out with touch. They start helping out with hearing. And that gives the blind individual a little bit of an advantage for those senses. Okay, so this is stuff we've talked about, the fact that we all activate our brains, whether we're sighted or blind. We all activate our brains when we touch something in the touch brain areas. Okay, but the research shows that you know, through various techniques, whether it's looking at brains after a brain lesion, or through this really cool technique you just learned about, transcranial magnetic stimulation, where we temporarily induce a very subtle lesion, essentially, or we break the brain for a very short time in a very subtle way, that can show that, in fact, for blind individuals, the area of their brain that's typically used for sight, the visual brain areas, are now used for the other senses. It allows the the blind person to be more sensitive to touch. And so where a blind person, when they get a transcranial magnetic stimulation pulse in their touch brain areas, it does the same thing that it would do to all of us. We would all have a loss of sense of shape discrimination to some degree, okay? But then if you swing this little set of mouse ears over, oops, right here, and put it behind our visual cortex, for us, when the pulse affects our visual cortex, not much happens to our sense of touch. It does affect our sense of vision. Things become a little blurry for a short time, but that's not the most interesting thing about this. The interesting thing about this is when you do that for blind individuals, it doesn't affect their sense of sight at all. They don't have sight. It affects their sense of touch too, but in a really interesting way. They don't lose their ability to discriminate general shapes like squares and spheres and pyramids and things like that. It affects their fine touch discrimination, the type they might know if they in fact do know Braille. And that suggests then that their visual brain areas come into play when it comes to helping their sense of touch, and also, as we'll see, helping their sense of hearing compensate for the lost sense. And this is the big picture I'm trying to convey here in today's lecture, is this idea of cross-modal plasticity. And then I'm going to get into the bigger, more general issue of general plasticity and how our brains change with experience or with sensory loss. Okay, I'm going to warn you now. This is one of these lectures where it's probably the most technical lecture I'm going to be giving throughout the quarter. This one's a little challenging when it comes to the technical stuff. And for that reason, we'll take breaks. I'll make sure that I'm going slowly and clearly. You'll get a special visitor this afternoon. Later this morning, we'll have a special visitor that I hope you'll find entertaining. I just want you to kind of, hold on and try to keep your concentration there. If you drink coffee, drink a little bit more. We'll get through this. It's not a lot of technical stuff, but it probably is the most technical stuff we're dealing with in the course. Okay? All right, here we go. So what I'm going to talk about now is how cross-modal plasticity can work not just for the blind, but for all of us in a really interesting way. And these are experiments I'm going to be talking about now, where we basically induce a very short-term blindness in somebody simply by blindfolding them. So this is how it works. You put a person, undergraduate student who's willing to blindfold themselves for 5 days and get paid, I think, a lot of money. And it's done very safely. It's typically done in a laboratory that allows people to sleep over, or I think this particular study I'll be talking about today is one where people were put in a hospital bed or a hospital room, and they're made very comfortable, and they listen to music and to talk to people and eat and all that sort of stuff. But what's really interesting here is what happens to their brains just by being blindfolded for 5 days. So imagine now you're a person who's volunteered for your, say $300 to go into this experiment, and your blindfold is put on you, as you can see, it's a very good blindfold. So it actually it involves not just something like a bandage, but cotton things over your eyes so you're comfortable, but it really doesn't let in any light whatsoever. So it's not your basic blindfold you might use in a game or whatever. It is a very, very, very thorough blindfold. And what goes on here is, as you're sitting there in that hospital room for 5 days, you're going to be learning some things possibly, and your brain is going to be imaged continuously during those 5 days. Continuously, I mean at various times during each of those days. Your brain's going to be imaged using this technique that we've kind of, mentioned here and there, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And it's, fMRI, I'm sure you've heard of it. It's just a way for us to look at the brain There's some actually, this is a pretty old experiment. So these are some early fMRI images. They're much clearer now, and they're, they can be coded in color, and they're really very detailed. But I think these are the images that were used for this particular study. And this functional magnetic resonance imaging is done right after you put the blindfold on, and then periodically throughout each of the 5 days. Okay. Now, there's going to be different groups of subjects that are going to be asked to do different things besides being blindfolded and besides being imaged. There's going to be a group of subjects that's going to be asked to be tested during raised dot discrimination. Okay, actually, I misspoke a little bit. Let me stand back, make sure I get this clear. Everybody in this experiment is going to be tested on raised dot discrimination. Now, it's a tiny bit tricky to realize, but this raised dot discrimination is very much like Braille, but it isn't Braille itself. So Braille has, particular shapes that indicate particular letters. This raised dot discrimination really doesn't involve such complex forms, but the dots are a little bit smaller. It's just a way to test how your sense of touch has changed over the 5 days. Okay, so it is like Braille, but it's not exactly Braille. Now is when we break the groups into different tasks. We'll talk about the 3 different groups in a second, but imagine you're in the group that actually is going to be trained. And throughout the 5 days, you are in fact going to be trained with Braille intensively. You're going to be taught to read Braille for 6 hours every day. Okay. I mean, I know it's intensive, but what else are you going to do? You're gonna eat and listen to music, maybe listen to TV, whatever, listen to podcasts. But during that time, you are going to be, kind of formally trained to learn Braille the way a blind person does. And that's the Braille that that's being shown here. That's the one with the letters and all that stuff. And then you're going to be imaged at the end of each of those days. Okay, there's going to be brain pictures taken while you're now trying to go through the original dot discrimination task, which, as I said, is a tiny bit different from Braille. It's not important, the technical details of this, but when I say dot discrimination, it is not quite Braille. It's just the question is going to be whether your learning of Braille is going to play a role in maybe making your dot discriminations later better. Okay. And then on your final day of going through this, there's going to be continued imaging of your brain to see what's going on with your brain as you're learning Braille. And then we're going to apply that technique we think is so cool, that transcranial magnetic stimulation technique, to see if whatever advantage you've gained during those 5 days can be, kind of wiped out, at least temporarily, by using TMS on different parts of your brain. So you can anticipate what we're doing here. Basically, what we're trying to do is to see if we can induce the same pattern that we saw with blind individuals, now with blindfolded people just like you. Remember what that pattern is with blindfolded individuals. They use their visual brains to help them touch. Can we do the same thing to you just in 5 days? Okay, so here's what the results look like. So here we go. First of all, we find that as we test you throughout the 5 days, in fact, your visual brain becomes more and more involved in your touch discrimination. Okay, let me say that again. That's important. Your visual brain areas, the parts back here, okay, the parts that are being shown back here, based on the pictures of that area, your visual brain gets more and more involved as you do that touch discrimination task throughout the 5 days. So in a sense, your brain is starting to go through this cross-modal plasticity just in this very, very short time. Okay, so it does increase over 5 days. Okay, so your visual brain saying, I'm really getting nothing here, and I can certainly use my power here to help out other senses. Does any other sense need my help? Is any other sense going through a task that I could help with? And visual brain says, oh, over here, I need your help. I'm sorry, touch brain goes, over here, I need your help, visual brain, because I'm trying to learn to be a more sensitive toucher. And so, yeah, I could use your help. And visual brain says, okay, no problem. I'm going to help your touch discrimination by kind of giving you some of my brain power to help touch. And that increases over the 5-day period. Okay. Interestingly, there's another group of subjects, right? I told you there's going to be 3 groups of subjects. There was a group of subjects that didn't have to check into a hospital room and be blindfolded. There was a group of subjects that were just taught Braille. Okay, so this is a really cool experiment because not only is it a way to see if the same sort of cross-modal plasticity can occur with people that are just blindfolded for a few days. By using different groups of subjects, we can determine whether the practice of Braille is important or being blindfolded is important, or both. So we can address this question now. And as it turns out, there was another group of subjects that weren't blindfolded. They didn't check into a hospital room. They didn't have this fancy pants blindfold put on. Instead, they could see fine during their days and nights. They would just come into the laboratory and they would close their eyes or be blindfolded and be taught Braille for 6 hours a day to see if their brains changed. And their brains did change, but not nearly as much as the group of subjects that were blindfolded for 5 days and were taught Braille. So there does seem to be something with visual deprivation that induces the visual brain to really help out with touch. Okay, pretty cool. Guess what? There was another group, okay, that helped out with this experiment. And that group also checked into the hospital room. They're down the hall, pretend, right? They checked into the hospital room and they are blindfolded for 5 days, but they didn't have to learn Braille, those lucky guys, right? They didn't have to go through this 6-hour Braille training that our group did. They just sat in the they just sat in a hospital room blindfolded. And they did various things. They listened to music, they talked to people, but they were not tested on Braille. Okay, and so I want you to predict in your head now, if you're not looking at the slides ahead of me, predict in your head, are they going to do better or worse or about the same as our group, who not only were blindfolded, but also were methodically trained and taught Braille for 6 hours a day? It's a surprising result. Their brains changed as much as our brains, just by virtue of being blindfolded. They didn't go through this crazy 6-hour-a-day Braille training, okay? But their brains changed as much. Their visual brain areas helped their touch areas as much as ours did, despite not being trained to read Braille. And I should also say, their performance was really good too, okay? So they were able to discriminate dots as well as we were ultimately, despite not being trained in Braille. And that gives a really big clue into what cross-modal plasticity is based on. You would think that, well, of course you're being trained in Braille. That's going to induce a lot of changes in the brain, and it might induce something. But you really don't even need that. If you're blindfolded, your visual brain is saying, help, help, help. What am I going to do? I need to help somebody out. And the touch brain says, okay, come on in. You can help me out. I'm just hanging out, but still you can help me out. And when it comes to any sort of tests with touch, help out. It's interesting because this is now a little bit beyond the book. It's a little bit certainly beyond the lecture, but I'm now teaching a graduate seminar in cross-modal plasticity. And there are theories as to why this happened. Why would the visual brain areas help touch and hearing, even though there were not necessarily more tasks or training involved? And the idea is that the visual brain doesn't want to, kind of become vestigial. The visual brain doesn't want to kind of stop doing something. It wants to keep working. even if there's nothing, no task, no training that it needs to immediately help with, to say, hey, listen, I don't want to get lazy, I don't want to die off or anything, I need to do something. And it helps the touch brain, or it helps the hearing brain, even though there's no immediate task to help with. Okay, so cross-modal plasticity is probably largely induced just by the deprivation of a sense. Okay, and then what else happens? If during that last day, and we talked a little bit about this transcranial magnetic stimulation, if during the last day, transcranial magnetic stimulation is imparted to the visual areas of the brain, in fact, it will reduce, it will reduce the ability to make that discrimination, okay? So if you are in the group that I've been describing, the one that has been trained in Braille, or if you're the one that's been blindfolded and wasn't trained in Braille, we all became better at discrimination. And that occurred unless that last day, when this occurred, you got that transcranial magnetic stimulation, which breaks the visual brain, okay? It just temporarily kind of knocks it out. And what that does is it makes your discrimination abilities, which were heightened during the blindfolding, disappear. Okay. So what does this mean? It means that visual deprivation, it's the visual deprivation itself, seems to allow your visual brain to enhance your touch discrimination. It's the blindfolding, it's the deprivation in the visual brain that allows it to help the other senses. Yes, I'm sure training is going to help, and we're going to see how training is going to change your brain when you learn something new. But in cross-modal plasticity, first of all, one big lesson is you don't need to be, blind over a long period of time for this to occur. Okay, you can be blindfolded for 5 days. It doesn't even need to be the case that you're trained on a touch task, because just being blindfolded induces the same, more or less, the same amount of visual involvement in touch than if you were trained. So it seems to be the deprivation to the visual brain saying, help, help, I need to do something, or I could become vestigial, I could die. Okay, that's what I mean here by vestigial. It's not really an active part of the brain anymore. And so it says, I need to help somebody, even if, the other brain areas don't need immediate help right now. And it goes ahead and does that, which is pretty cool. Okay. I see some questions, and I want to make sure that I take a few breaks here. So let me do that. Let's look at some questions. Oops, sorry. Okay. What are the differences between the tongue display unit versus tongue-based vision of 1960? Aida, we're going to go through the tongue display in just a second. It's a great question, but we're going to go through the tongue display in just a second, so I'm going to hold that off. Not sure if it was just me, but the audio cut out. Anybody else having trouble with audio right now? No, you're okay? Just them. Okay. All right, but do let me know. Okay, you'd ask another good question. For cross-modal neuroplasticity in 5 days experiment, anybody can do it even if their visual regions of the brain is temporary. Is that right? Yeah, so if you're, so the idea here is that the transcranial magnetic stimulation is going to be applied to see, it's kind of a way of really determining if the visual brain areas are really, what's involved in making discrimination better when somebody is blindfolded. And so you apply that transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it kind of stops that area from helping out touch just temporarily. Think of other questions, but let me just tell you something. And this is often a question I get, so you might be anticipating this. After the experiment is over, how long do your touch skills keep their kind of heightened form? I mean, are you always going to be better at touch than everybody else because you were in this 5-day experiment? And the answer is no. It does start to revert fairly quickly, probably over the course of a few days, and they have tested it in these sort of experiments. So they'll have people come back to the laboratory, and test them say 2-3 days after they've been blindfolded, and they say, let's see if your visual brain is still involved in touch, and let's see if your touch discrimination is better. And as it turns out, it's pretty much reverted once the visual brain gets a lot of visual information, and again saying, okay, well, it was nice working with your touch, but I'm going to go back and work with vision now. So it does revert fairly quickly. Okay. Any other questions about the involvement in touch in these experiments? Because I think these are really interesting experiments. By the way, I've had a chance to chat with some people at conferences who have actually been subjects in these experiments, and ask them what the experience is like. And as you can imagine, it's not the most pleasant experience, but they try to make it as nice as possible. But the person I talked to was a subject in the group that didn't learn Braille, but went through touch discrimination. And what they said is they were kept from kind of trying to touch too much of their world. So, when you're blindfolded, you can imagine, you try to touch a lot to kind of guide yourselves around. But they wanted to make sure that group didn't have too much touch stimulation to, in fact, see if it was the visual deprivation that changed the brain. And they said it was kind of hard to kind of navigate the room. There was always somebody there to help them, but it was weird, not only not being able to see, but also not being able to touch very much. The other thing that people said in these experiments, and this kind of goes back to previous classes, is that one of the first things they notice when they're blindfolded, throughout their first day, is that food doesn't have its usual strong flavor. They say that food tastes much more bland when they've been blindfolded for the day. And that continues through the 5 days for them. They say, I started to regain my sense of taste a little bit as the 5 days went on, but no, I never regained what I really would prefer, when I eat, which is a full, kind of spectrum of flavors. And it wasn't until they were the blindfold was removed that they were then able to regain their sense of taste. And that makes perfect sense based on everything we've discussed with regard to taste, right? Taste is one of these senses that is so multisensory that it really relies on seeing the food. That's why I wasn't able to taste the food very well in my a dark restaurant. Food depends on there being a vision of food, as well as a smell and even sound and touch, of course. So I just thought that you'd find that interesting. Oh, good question. Natalie asked a question. Is sensory deprivation experiment done at UCR? That's a great question. Not often. We have done a little bit at UCR. We have done blindfolding, and we've done blindfolding in a shorter form when it comes to the methods. It's actually, I'm about to show you a slide that's going to discuss the fact that you can induce some of the same effects, not just with blindfolding for 5 days, but blindfolding for 3 hours. And so we did try some of this, and we were interested to see to what degree hearing changed. And we didn't really find a lot of large effects the way we were testing it, but there is research that hearing is also enhanced. It might be fun to try that again, as long as we can blindfold people for a few hours. Yeah, other people have found those sort of effects. It's a very good question, Natalie. Anything else? Okay, then let's go ahead and do one of our questions. Hold on just a second. Okay, here we go. So we'll do a poll. All right. What is the main reason that most blind individuals have better touch sensitivity? A, their use of Braille. Okay. B, their touch brain can reassign to vision. C, the visual brain can reassign to touch, or both A and B. Okay, be careful here. Read carefully. What is the main reason that most blind individuals have better touch sensitivity? Okay, all right. Are you allowed to change your answer? I can't remember. It looks like a lot of people did after reading the question carefully, which is good. But it doesn't make a difference how you do on this. I'm going to explain it to you, and I'm going to explain it's a little tricky. Okay. Good. All right. Don't worry about it if you didn't get your preference in. That's not a problem. This is just important that we learn something from this question. What is the main reason that most blind individuals have better touch sensitivity? Remember something I said in the previous class? It was just on the slide I showed as we were doing an introduction to today's lecture. Very few blind people actually use Braille. Okay. What did we say? 10%? I actually think it's less now. I should look it up again. I think it's closer to 8%. So that it can't be a reason why most blind individuals have better touch sensitivity. So A is not true, which means D is not true, right? It's both A and B can't be true. B, their touch brain can be reassigned to vision. No, it's not that their touch brain is reassigned to vision. It is, in fact, C, that their visual brain is being reassigned to touch. So the correct answer here is C. The great majority of you guys got it right. Way to go. Both A and B, of course, can't be right because we said that, well, they're both wrong. Most blind people do not use Braille, and their touch brain isn't dedicated to vision. It is their visual brain that is dedicated to touch. Great. Great. Most of you did terrific. So here you go. Yeah, as you can see, most of you did great. Okay, any other last minute questions before we continue with our discussion? All right. Close this, share our screen, and make me big. That is a really cool background picture, I have to say. And that was a very cool looking night, if I can say so myself. What we're going to talk about now is something I just mentioned, that this deprivation over 5 days is a very good way to kind of test these different things out. I think it's a very interesting method, and it's still being used. But as it turns out, you can induce similar, although weaker effects with much less deprivation. So this is shorter term deprivation. This is the sort of thing we did in our lab. We didn't, as I say, kind of follow through or publish on this, but a lot of people have used this technique. And these techniques are often used not with brain imaging, although they can be. They can just be used by testing behavior. And what you find is after 3 hours, just 3 hours of blindfolding, which is a thing that we can do in our lab. We don't have to have people check into a hospital room. 3 hours of blindfolding, what you do find is that their touch discrimination is in fact enhanced. And let me talk about how this experiment is done. I don't want to get too much into the details, but what they're able to do is determine that these are little, here, let's look at this image right here. This is supposed to be a finger right here, an index finger, and it's put under this kind of little stimulus apparatus here. And grids, touchable grids, are put onto the finger in either a horizontal or vertical position on your index finger. So either going this way or going this way, okay? And the question is, how much pressure needs to be applied so you can tell these little grid lines are in a kind of vertical position across your finger or a horizontal position across your finger. And what they find is just after 3 hours of blindfolding, and people aren't touching anything. In fact, I think they have to sit here with their hands like this and listen to music or talk with people or something like that. They're touching nothing. Just 3 hours of visual deprivation allows the visual brain to come in and help the touch brain be better and more sensitive, which is pretty cool. But that's not the only case. It is also true that there are times during the day when we are touching things and our visual brain helps us a little bit. So these are everyday touches, everyday uses of visual brain areas to help us touch. And these examples, I think the best example I can think of, and is why I put this little picture here, is, like if you're going home at night and you want to take your keys out to put into your locked front door, what you might do is when you put your finger into your pocket to grab your keys, you'll feel around for the key that is your front door key. Okay, so you're using your fingers to determine which of your keys on your keychain are the front door key. Okay, I think this experience we've all had, right? When you're doing that, it is very likely you're actually using not just the part of your brain that's reserved for touch, you're using the part of your brain that also helps you see. And it's not necessarily because it's dark at night either, which is interesting. This probably happens during the day too. I just gave you the example of doing this so you can imagine having to touch your keys. But touching your keys in order to determine kind of the spatial details, the kind of shape details, is known to induce visual activity in the visual parts of your brain. So what we call spatial touch, finding objects by touch, is known to induce activity in those parts of the brain that are involved in vision. And we know that both through looking at somebody's brain as they're carefully touching keys. I'm looking to see if this is not a bad object. So imagine, yeah, actually, this is a good one, because I don't know if you can see this, but probably not. There's a little bump on some of these buttons here that allow me to determine what button I'm pushing without having to look at it. It could be that when I'm doing that, I'm actually activating part of my visual brain, because it is such a kind of fine-grained touch. It's such a kind of challenging part of touch for somebody who's sighted like me, that I might be enlisting my visual brain. So if you were to take an MRI of my brain as I'm doing this, or as you're trying to feel your keys, you might find that visual brain is helping out a little bit. And in fact, you can do it the other way. Remember, fMRI and transcranial magnetic stimulation are both really great ways of doing that. What you could find is that if you are in an experiment room and touching something like keys, and you're able to determine which key is which of your keychain, if in fact you came around with a transcranial magnetic stimulation device and just briefly pulsed back here on the visual cortex, you might have more problems determining which key is which. So even in our everyday uses, our everyday touch uses, okay, our visual brains do sometimes help us touch better. It's not like the sort of thing for a blind person where the visual brain is so, kind of rededicated to touch, or even in blindfolding experiments, whether 5 days or 3 hours. It's not to that extent. But our visual brain does kind of get involved sometimes, even when we're touching in daylight, if it's a challenging touch task. What does this mean? It's going to be something we're going to be seeing again and again throughout the rest of the quarter. This idea of cross-sensory plasticity is not just something true of the blind or the deaf, right? We've kind of introduced it in that context, right? That for the blind, the visual brain gets rededicated to touch, gets rededicated to hearing. We'll see the same for the deaf. The point I'm trying to make is that this is true of all of our brains, that the brain areas can kind of swap to some degree. They can swap their function to help out in challenging tasks. Cross-sensory plasticity is true of your brain too. And in fact, it can be shown whether through blindfolding experiments or fine-grained touch experiments, even when you're not blind. So it's not just something that occurs in the sensory impaired. It is one of your perceptual superpowers. Okay? Remember, that's the big story here in the class. We're trying to uncover things about your perceptual brain and your perceptual skills that you didn't know you had, and here is one. That parts of the brain that are typically, or I guess largely dedicated to one sense can say, hey, I can help out. I can help out if you guys need help. And that's not something true with blind people or deaf people alone. It's true for all of us. That's the kind of flexibility our brain has. Okay, that's kind of the big story we're trying to uncover here. What we're going to do now is shift gears just a we are going to shift gears just a tiny bit, but something that's more connected than I originally thought. And it is something that Aida keeps on asking about, so she must be really interested. So I imagine a lot of you are interested in this. It's this idea that we can taste scenes. So that's the name of that section in the book. And I don't want to, kind of be too, secretive about what this means. What this has to do with is something called the tongue display unit. And you're seeing it right here. So This is a device that's been designed to potentially help the blind picture scenes that are in front of them. I'll talk about the technical details of this example in just a second, but I want to give you a tiny bit of history of this. So I know about this partly because I think I mentioned to you in the very first day of class that one of the reasons I became a perceptual psychologist is because my dad used to run an agency for the blind and visually impaired. And he had a lot of devices in his office that had been designed to help the blind. And one of them was this thing that you could kind of strap onto your back. And basically, the thing that you strapped onto your back, it was a backpack that kind of had little posts, like a grid of, say, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 posts that would kind of vibrate on your back, on the skin on your back, very gently and comfortably. It was a heavy thing, but it was a comfortable thing to feel on your back. And you would, basically, there was a camera that was connected to this, and you would move around the camera, point it to different things in a room, and then whatever image the camera picked up would then be translated onto the vibrations that were occurring on your back. So it was a big grid of little posts that would vibrate on your back. And if you aimed your camera to, say, a little rectangle, something like this, a rectangle pattern would be put on your back in vibrating posts. And some people would be able to say, oh, that must be a rectangle. You can imagine how this might feel, right? Have you ever played that game when you were a kid where somebody traces a shape on your skin or something and you have to guess what it is? Is that a triangle or a square? Or whose name am I writing in cursive? You ever done that sort of thing? It would kind of be like that, but it was a device that was made for the blind. Okay, that was something that existed a long time ago. And it wasn't great. It didn't work really well. Blind people found it very cumbersome, and they had to carry not just this backpack that held all these posts, vibrating posts that were on their back, but the energy requirement, the batteries that were required for this thing were immense. And so it never became very popular. It was kind of a cool way of testing things out for research, but it never became very popular for the blind. Now we have something called the tongue display unit, and it is the same principle. And as you can see on this image here, it is a grid, not unlike the grid that was used on the back of people a long time ago. But this grid doesn't apply to the back. It gets placed on the tongue. And the tongue is a good place to do this in some ways because the tongue will kind of conduct electricity with much less of kind of a power requirement. In other words, you can induce kind of tactile feeling on the tongue without having to carry a huge battery to power the unit, which is why it's on the tongue. The tongue is a good place to conduct electricity, and you might know that if you've ever. People don't do this anymore, but before we had the internet, we had to find fun things to do. So we would take a 9-volt battery and touch it to our tongues and get like a thrill out of it because we kind of feel the little charge that comes out of it. Has anyone ever done that before? Yeah. Okay. No. Again, we didn't have the internet. Anyway, it's like that. It doesn't hurt though. It's more like, I had a chance to experience this. You put this thing on your tongue and it feels kind of like it's maybe champagne bubbles or how champagne bubbles are smaller. It's more like champagne bubbles than like soda or beer or something like that. But you feel like these little kind of bubbles on your tongue when this thing's placed on your tongue. And if you concentrate very carefully, you can start feeling shapes in these little bubble feelings. Okay, so you could aim a camera towards a rectangle and feel like a little pattern of rectangle stimulation on your tongue. And potentially, because this is such an easier, it's much less cumbersome than having to wear something major on your back, and you don't have to carry around these giant batteries. It's a much smaller little power unit. It is much more, I guess, usable potentially for the blind. The question is, how difficult is it to use? And what I'm going to show you is a little video, and I hope this works okay. I keep on forgetting to link to these videos. I promise I will. But let me show you the video. Oh my gosh, it won't work. Shoot. Okay. For some reason, this one will not work. But the video, okay, this is what the video shows. The video shows a particular blind individual who is at the offices of the company who developed the tongue display unit. And he's had a lot of practice, and it shows him able to kind of move around kind of, one of those large kind of human mazes where they're made out of, kind of foam blocks. And he's able to get around, navigate that area, that maze, by using the tongue display unit. He's had a lot of practice. Without training, people aren't very good. In fact, the interviewer of this blind individual tries it himself and is asked to, try to recognize things. And without any practice at all, this interviewer was able to, say whether a line was posted in front of him or a curve. So they had him put the tongue unit on, they aimed the camera at a wall, and they put either lines or curves. And he was able to, after a few seconds, able to discriminate between lines and curves. But what people report after they have some practice with this is that after a while, after a few days, maybe a few weeks, they are able to get other things like shapes, maybe like squares or rectangles versus spheres, or then they can start determining something's moving like a rolling ball. And then after some experience with this, like the blind individual who would have been shown in this video, I'll link it, they are able to do things like, move around, say, an office area that's been set up to be a little bit like a maze. And they show him walking through the halls, too, by the way, of this office. He's able to recognize letters that are displayed in front of him. And he is able to do this fairly well. Okay. So we'll talk about the success. This is available. If you're interested, you could actually buy this device right now, and it is offered to blind people. And I believe there's often there's grant money to help the blind pay for these things. And we'll talk about how popular it's been in just a second. But before we do, I want to talk about some of the maybe kind of the more scientific ramifications, because there's something very interesting that happens. When people are interviewed that have been using this for a long time, they're asked, when did you start feeling comfortable that you could actually use this for more than just, determining that there's a line or curve in front of you? And they'll say something very interesting. They'll say, there's a time where you stop just feeling the pattern on your tongue and you start to have a sense that these objects are out in front of you, that these objects are out in the world, and you kind of experience them separate from your body. So you can imagine, when I tried this out for the first time, that it felt like, just bubbles on my tongue, right? And the bubbles, after a while, I could feel patterns a little bit. It's tough. But people who use this for a long time, matter of weeks, maybe months, they are able to do a lot more. And they say that there was this kind of a shift where they feel more confident, more comfortable doing it. And at that point, they start to feel that the objects they're perceiving are not just tongue patterns, but also things that are real out in the world in front of them. Okay, so they start, I guess we could say, externalizing their experience. They start externalizing their experience to outside their bodies, right? And this is a fascinating fact. We find that it is at that time when people, whether blind or sighted, that when they start experiencing these objects, not just as tongue stimulation, but also as something outside their body, that's when the visual brain regions really come in to help. Okay, so here, I think this is really interesting, maybe more than the rest of the world does. But when a person starts to have this kind of, I guess, introspective experience, like not only, yes, I do still feel these tickles on my tongue, but now I'm also kind of almost imagining or perceiving things that are out in the world. I perceive, shapes and balls and mazes and things that are out there. It is at that time where the visual brain areas that are not, being involved anymore, or at least for a blind person or for a blindfolded person, it's at that time that these areas really come in to help the touch brain in this case, which is cool. So one's experience is almost predictive of the visual brain's involvement, which is, I think, a really interesting thing. Okay, so now the question is this a popular device? Why don't I see every blind individual around campus, or as I walk through a downtown area or whatever? Why don't all blind people have them? Well, it is not a very popular thing. It is a difficult thing to use. It takes a lot of training, and even when people are trained, the resolution isn't great. So that's what's being shown down here. The number of little diodes here, the number of little stimulation posts or electrodes here, is still such that the resolution of an image would be something like this if we were to think of it visually. Okay, this would be the real image that everyone who's sighted would be able to see. Okay, and this is currently what the tongue display unit can kind of transform the stimulation in. So it's the case that the resolution of these devices isn't good enough to really be that useful. So you can imagine, you can see how the car's shape is translated to what would be the stimulation on the tongue. Okay, you can imagine somebody could maybe determine there's a big object there, but what exactly that object is from this distance is still hard. They're saying maybe in another 5 years it can get to this level, but it is still really poor. So it's unclear whether this type of device is going to be ultimately usable for the blind to kind of substitute touch for vision. It doesn't seem to be there yet. Whether it's going to be there in 5, 10, 15 years isn't clear. The truth is, there are now ways of stimulating the visual system that now in a blind individual, artificially through various devices, various implantation, various types of, kind of genetic therapies, that sort of thing, that are probably going to be ultimately more useful. So my prediction is these sort of tongue display unit kind of tactile sort of substitution devices probably won't be ultimately what's going to help the blind when it comes to some sort of prosthetics, some sort of kind of electronic way of helping the blind. It's more likely that some stimulation actually to the visual nervous system will probably be more successful. That's my guess from my perspective. Okay, cool. Let's take a break and see if there's questions here. All right. Okay, Natalie asked this question. I remember at a psych lab fair, they had a perception lab with different sized PVC pipes, and I could ask if I could find a color. Find color based on PVC pipes. I'm unaware of that. It's hard for me to imagine color would be something that you could apprehend with touch, unless you were feeling, of course, the oil paints that John Bramblett feels. There is a different consistency in the different pigments, but I don't know if color on its own would be something that you could apprehend by touch, but I'd be interested in hearing more about that. Oh, Thomas says that you've done the tongue display unit. Is that right? At your old school? Is this true? Is that what you've done, Thomas? You've actually experienced the tongue display unit, or was it something else that you're referring to? Oh, okay. I don't know, but that's really interesting. Natalie, okay. Oh, they were different sized. Oh, so at a psych fair, you weren't asked to identify the color as much as the size of the different objects and the PVC pipes. We're going to be talking about that soon. We're going to be talking about that actually in our next lecture, about being able to feel the length of something, not by actually feeling along its full length, but just by taking a little piece of it and swinging it back and forth and being able to determine the length that way. Okay? Other questions? Well, I guess that's it for now. Okay, so listen. I know this is complicated. I know this is complicated stuff, and actually the next few slides are some of the most complicated stuff we're going to do. So I'm going to take a little break and introduce a guest for today, and that guest is, hold on just a second. That guest is none other than Rabbini the Magic Bunny. Ta-da! All right, Rabbini wants to do a magic trick for you. Are you ready? I'm going to need actually a volunteer from the class. And so the first person that says me on the chat gets to be a volunteer. First person to say me. Okay, Matthew is our volunteer. Okay, Matthew, thank you so much. We've never met in person, Matthew. Well, you never met Rabbini, right? The Magic Bunny, clearly. But let me just make sure. This is a regular deck of cards. Matthew, do you agree? Yes? Right? Thank you, Matthew. Okay. What I'm going to do now, Matthew, is mix it up. Here, can you see? Oh, I realize there's, poor Rabbini lives in the grass, but here, I'll mix it up for you. Okay. Nicely mixed up. And what I'd like to do, I'd like you to pick a card, and what I'm going to do, since you're not here, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of take cards off the top, and I want you to tell me to stop when you pick a card. When it feels right, stop. Okay. Still there, Matthew? Stop. Okay. So you said stop. I hope I didn't pressure you into saying stop. Do you want to keep going? I don't mind if you want to keep going, Matthew. Do you want to keep going? No, it's okay. All right. So Matthew picked a card. And what I'm going to do is Rabbini is going to close his eyes, his little Rabbini eyes, and I'm going to show the entire class what the card is, but I am not going to look. And you'll see it doesn't make too much of a difference anyway. Okay. Matthew picked this card. Everyone see it? Okay, what I'm going to do is close the deck and mix everything up. Rabbini's not good at mixing things with his eyes closed, but that's okay. There we go. Now, Matthew, did you see the card, Matthew? Is that okay? Everyone got the card? Yep. Okay, it's important you remember the card, because if you don't remember the card, the trick's not going to work good. But Rabbini is now going to show you the fastest trick in the West. And what he's going to do is just put his finger in here and pull out your card. Matthew, is in fact this your card? Is that your card? No, but close. All right, you want to see the second fastest trick in the West? Okay, we'll do it again. Matthew, is this your card? That colder. Oh, shoot. Okay, well, this doesn't happen to the great Rabbini very much, but I'll tell you something. When it does happen, I am fortunate, because what I have here is a magician's insurance policy. Can you all see that? Magician's insurance policy? And if you look through the magician's insurance policy, it has conditions of the policy right here. It says things like, all parties involved must be dealing with a full deck. Oh, I get it. We must, you've heard the expression, you're not dealing with a full deck. By the way, magician jokes are really stupid, okay? Let's see. Magician may have a second chance to locate a selected card if the spectator shorter than 8 feet tall, has less than 3 eyes, is not wearing snowshoes. Well, I did that and I failed at that. And then it says down here, if you can see this, Matthew, it says maximum benefits, here, right down here, maximum benefits are derived when the policy is fully extended. Maximum benefits are derived when the policy is fully extended. What do you think that means? What do you think that means? Fully extended. Oh, yes. Yes. I think this is what maybe it means. Is that your card? Thank you. Thank you. The great Rabbini, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Let's say goodbye to the great Rabbini and go back to lecture. Okay, let's continue. And actually, this is not too bad. We'll be able to do this. What time is it? Okay, we're good. Okay, we're now going to talk about what's a general topic, and it's called plasticity. And what it means, here, let me put my picture out bigger, is just how the brain changes. Now, we talked about cross-modal plasticity, where now we're going to generalize it to just the issue of plasticity. And in this case, we're going to see that, unlike the other case a little bit, our experience with touching does change how our brain is organized. So before we talked about the fact that cross-modal plasticity that experiment didn't need us to experience Braille in order for our brain to kind of shift around. Now we're kind of moving to another type of plasticity where our experience is going to change our brain. And this is the type of plasticity that a lot of people who study touch are interested in. And so the more you touch, the more your brain changes. So now we're just going to stick not to the visual system and how that changes, but now we're going to go right to the touch system and see how that changes. And let me just point out a few things here. Again, this is right here, that little map along the touch brain. And let me just remind you, the touch brain is this little strip right here, kind of right here. You only have it if you're bald. No, I'm just kidding. It's right there. And now you're looking at the touch brain from the front, okay? And you're seeing how it's mapped out. And as I already mentioned, it's mapped out based not on how large a body part is. So it's not like my leg, which is much bigger than most of my other body parts, get a lot of room here. The sensitivity and function of an area on the body determines how much area on the brain it gets dedicated. So, okay, we're very sensitive on our lips and our face when it comes to touch. And it's important that be the case because, you know, it kind of gives us feedback into how our lips are moving, how our face is moving. And so that sensitive part of our body is given a very large region when it comes to touch. Does that make sense? So it's the degree of sensitivity, the degree that it's used for sensitive touch purposes that determines how much of the brain area we get, okay? And so what we can do is now look at how the brain changes with experience, okay? Let's see how this works. So, So we're looking now at just plasticity in the touch brain area, in that little part of the brain, okay? And so let's talk about Braille users. Again, very few blind people use Braille, but they do use, the ones that do use Braille show something very, very interesting. Let me tell you a little bit about how Braille is read. Oh, do I have Braille here? No, I don't, but you've seen what Braille looks like. Braille is read typically with 3 fingers on each hand. So, as a blind individual is going through a page of Braille, they're using these 3 fingers. Typically, they don't use their thumb and their pinky. After years and years of using Braille, what you see is that the brain areas start shifting around in terms of how they're dedicated to different body parts. So this little map on the touch brain area changes around based on one's experience with touch when it comes to Braille. Braille users have now a larger part of their brain dedicated to those 3 fingers than somebody who doesn't know Braille. So you're seeing now that Braille use can change the brain. Okay, and it doesn't necessarily, bring in the visual brain like we talked about before, but it does change the brain when it comes just to the touch area. So if I were to show you a map here of somebody who knows Braille, there would be more area dedicated to these 3 middle fingers than somebody who doesn't know Braille. Okay, does that make sense? So like the touch brain kind of, makes extra room and saying, okay, if those fingers are going to be important for touch, I'm going to give it more room. I'm going to give it more processing power. And I'm going to therefore probably allow those 3 fingers to be a little bit more sensitive. Okay, what else do you find? Well, let's talk about other experts in touch besides Braille users. Maybe you play an instrument. Maybe you play violin or guitar or something like that. Violin players, if they're right-handed players, show that they have more area dedicated to their left hand fingers than their right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about violin. I do not have a violin here. Well, I have something kind of like a violin here. Okay, stay right there. Nobody move. This is not a violin, but Uh-oh. Okay. It kind of looks like a violin a little bit, right? Okay. It's actually a bass if you're interested. Okay. But it's a violin now for our purposes. And look how violin is played. I'm playing here. This is a good shot. Okay. Here's my bow. And here's my violin. And as you can see, my right hand is a right-hand violin player. I'm really just gripping the bow like this and moving it back and forth. The really fine touch skills come in on the left hand where I'm doing this type of thing, right? I bet you want to hear how a samurai sword sounds on a bass as I pretend to play it as a violin. Not bad. Okay. Anyway, as you can see, most of the fine touch has to come in the left hand. And that's what you find with expert violin players. And I'm not talking about professional even. I'm talking about if you continue to play violin after learning it as a kid, if we did a scan of your brain area, the area dedicated to your left hand fingers would be larger than the area dedicated to your right hand fingers, which don't need the same touch discrimination. There's a lot of examples about this. There's, people who, are woodworkers and use tools over and over again. That even sometimes kind of plays a role in how the brain is mapped. So, for example, in an experiment, this is what this is showing down here. This is an experiment down here where somebody is sitting in front of a wooden board and is asked to move a series of corks. I believe they're like wine bottle corks or bottle stoppers around different areas on the board using, I guess, some sort of tong, tongs that you might use to pull toast out of the toaster or something like that. And what you find after a certain kind of, I guess maybe a day or so of trying to perform this task is that it's almost as if the brain makes room for you to better feel the cork through the tongs and into your fingers, so that more area is kind of dedicated to the fingers of the hand that's actually manipulating the cork through touch with these tongs. So with tool use, even kind of tool use that can be established in the lab, you do find that the brain shifts around to kind of make room for that. And what you find is that you do actually not only dedicate more area to that set of fingers or whatever, you actually find that your touch is enhanced. You become more sensitive. And this is shown in a number of different ways. But, hold on just a second, sorry. A number of different ways, but one of the most well-known experiments that show this is with pianists. And these are pianists that have played most of their lives. And yes, they do dedicate a larger proportion of their brain to the different fingers that are acting on the keyboard. So I guess for a pianist, what do you have here? You have 5 fingers on each hand, and that is going to be a disproportionately large amount dedicated to the 10 fingers than somebody who doesn't play piano. That's absolutely true. The brain shifts around. But in addition to that, you find folks like pianists and certainly the Braille and certainly violin players, that they have better sensitivity, what they call two-point touch sensitivity. And this is a very standard test that's done in a doctor's office. It's just a way of determining how sensitive your touch is by asking a person to close their eyes and tell the experimenter when they feel a single point touching them versus 2 points touching them. Okay. And as you can see, it's a very simple thing you can buy, I think, for $1 or $2 online. It's done with old people sometimes to see how their sense of touch is working on their feet and stuff like that. You can see that at first you can just touch them with a single point, but then slowly you can see as you go around this wheel, there's a separation of 2 points that increases, right? So at first the 2 points are very close, and most older people, for example, won't be able to tell you that's 2 points. Maybe down by here, they'll say, oh yes, now I feel 2 points. And certainly by here, most everybody could say, oh yeah, I feel 2 points that are touching my skin versus 1, okay? If you're a pianist, if you're a violinist, if you do something else that involves a lot of kind of touch sensitivity on your hands, probably sewing, probably other things like that, maybe even video games, I don't know. Your touch sensitivity is better, and it is by virtue of your brain having changed from experience, okay? This is plasticity. This is what we're talking about. Your brain can change not only from a sense being deprived or even kind of temporarily being deprived, but within a sense, the area that's associated can shift around how it's dedicated to different parts of the body in this case, depending on how important that is to the person using it. To a pianist, the finger sensitivity is important. To a violinist, the finger sensitivity is important. So in fact, to them, they're going to have a higher proportion of their touch brain dedicated to it, okay? And this is the heart of plasticity. This is what really goes on with it. Wow, how are we doing here? I think I'm going to stop class a little early today because the next slide is one of the most technical slides we have. You know, gives you a little bit extra time for lunch. Have a good few days, and we'll see you on Thursday.